Hello, friends. Today I want to tell you about ancient Egypt. And before we dive into the story itself, let me ask you something. Did you know that the Egyptians believed that speaking a person's name could influence their soul even after death? Fascinating, isn't it? It always seemed to me that a people who treated words, the sound of a voice, and the meaning of a name with such seriousness simply could not help but create something magnificent. And today, we'll talk about how they lived, what they built, and why their civilization continues to amaze us thousands of years later. And do you ever stop to think about such little things? Imagine night around you. The darkness has not yet yielded to the sun, but you can already feel in the air that a new day is about to begin. This is how the world awoke along the Nile. The river murmured softly but confidently, as if nature itself were saying, "I am here, I am near. I will feed you as long as time exists." Ancient Egypt was born not from the sword, not from conquest. It was born from a river. And such an origin already shapes the character of a people. When your river brings fertile silt every year and gives life to the land, you see the world differently. You feel that life is cyclical, that after the flood there is always calm, that after death there must be a new path. The Egyptians said, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile." And it was not just a pretty phrase. Without the Nile, they would not have survived. All settlements, temples, villages, cities arose precisely where the water touched the land. The annual flooding of the Nile was an event everyone waited for, from peasants to priests. In the waters of the river, they saw not only a natural force, but also the presence of the gods. And if you think about it, isn't that logical? When your land can become fertile simply because a great river grants you life, you cannot treat nature as something ordinary. Long ago, before Egypt became a state, small nomadic tribes wandered the desert. They searched for food, water, better conditions. And when they first saw the Nile, it appeared as a true miracle. Endless stores of fish, marshes full of birds, plants they could use for food, houses, clothing, boats. And perhaps you too can imagine the relief these people felt. They no longer had to wander constantly. Here by the river, they could stay. They could build a home. And have you ever wondered how important it is for a person simply to be able to stay in one place? It changes everything. Your lifestyle, your thoughts, your beliefs. Thus, the first small settlements appeared. People built simple mud houses and learned to work the land. They learned to sow, to harvest, to domesticate animals. And the longer they lived together, the more rules appeared. Someone managed irrigation. Someone settled disputes. Someone communicated with spirits and gods on behalf of the community. This is how the first nomes, small regions with their own chief and their own temple, came into being. Centuries passed. The chiefs grew in influence. Some nomes united, others fought. And then, one day, a ruler appeared who succeeded in doing what no one before him had achieved. uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. His name was Narmer, also known as Menes. He founded the first dynasty and created the foundation of what would later become a true empire. From this moment, the word pharaoh is born. And here's an interesting detail. At first, pharaoh did not mean ruler at all. It meant great house, that is, the palace. But over time, people began to use the word to refer to the ruler himself. I find it fascinating how even language shows the changing attitude toward power. And what do you think? Can a name determine who a person becomes? A pharaoh becomes not just a king. He becomes a god on earth. He was believed to be the son of Ra, the embodiment of Horus, the guardian of Ma'at, cosmic order. Imagine the responsibility, maintaining the balance of the world. If the pharaoh erred, if he did something wrong, people believed that the sun might rise incorrectly, the Nile might not flood, and the world could fall into chaos. And I don't know about you, but it seems to me that living with such a burden could not have been easy. It was during this period that the Egyptians began building what would become their most famous symbol, the pyramids. But the pyramids did not appear immediately. First came mastabas, simple rectangular tombs. They were used to bury rulers, local chiefs, important people. But one day, a man appeared who thought differently. His name was Imhotep, architect, physician, priest, sage, one of the most brilliant figures of his time. He was the advisor of Pharaoh Djoser. Imhotep proposed a new idea, not just a tomb, but a structure reaching into the sky. Thus, the first step pyramid was created. And if you imagine how it looked to the people of that time, a structure rising above the earth, like a staircase to the gods. Perhaps they truly believed that the pharaoh's soul would climb those steps to the heavens. A few generations later came Khufu, who ordered the construction of a pyramid that would outlast all centuries. And they built it. Millions of blocks, each weighing several tons. No machines, no iron tools, only people, stone, ropes, and incredible organization. And sometimes I wonder, what would we do in their place? Could we create such a wonder without modern technology? Life in ancient Egypt, despite the grandeur of its pyramids, was not limited to enormous building projects. To understand this world, it is enough to imagine yourself for a moment as an ordinary person living along the Nile. You wake to the morning sound of water and distant birdsong. The air is fresh, but you know that in a few hours, the heat will cover everything so intensely that even shade won't save you. That is why most peasants and craftsmen worked from early morning. Their lives revolved around the land, the harvest, livestock, and the rhythm of the river. The Egyptians were practical. They knew what it meant to depend on nature, while the peoples of Mesopotamia often suffered from unpredictable floods and devastation. The Nile behaved differently. It flooded at almost the same time every year. This gave people a sense of confidence, a kind of harmony with nature. They even believed the flood was a sign of divine blessing. And I think there is wisdom in that. When your river truly feeds you, protects you from hunger, and gives you hope, isn't it natural to see something sacred in it? The Egyptians had an extraordinary connection with the natural world. Everything, from cats to crocodiles, carried symbolic meaning. The cat protected the home because it killed mice that ate grain. Crocodiles were dangerous, but also sacred, reminding people of the Nile's strength. Even scarab beetles were sacred because they symbolized the sun, reborn each day. And when you think about this, you realize that this civilization did not see the world as a collection of random events, but as a grand plan where every creature had a place. Religion was the foundation of everything, not as dogma or rigid system, but as a way of seeing the world. They believed life was just one stage, death was another, and beyond it came the next, where human existence continued in another dimension. This is why it was so important to preserve the body. The body was the home of the soul. If it was destroyed, the soul might not find its way to the afterlife. So the art of mummification became a sacred science. The priests who practiced it were not mere craftsmen. They were seen as people who stood at the boundary between life and death. You may have heard that the Egyptians considered the heart the most important organ. It was the center of thoughts, feelings, morality. During mummification, they removed the brain because they believed it unnecessary for the afterlife. But the heart was left, because it was the heart that would be weighed after death. They believed that in the underworld the heart would be placed on scales, and on the other side, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth. If the heart was heavier, the person faced oblivion. If lighter or balanced, they received eternal life. And once again, I find it deeply meaningful that a culture believed the value of a person rested not in what they accumulated, but in the lightness of their heart. How does that philosophy feel to you? Returning to the living, Egypt was a society where everyone had a role. Peasants grew grain, the basis of food. Craftsmen made tools, furniture, clothing, amulets, figurines. Scribes dealt with documents, recording taxes, decrees, contracts, ritual texts. Scribes were particularly respected because literacy was rare. Hieroglyphs were complex. Each sign could represent a sound, a word, or an entire idea. Learning took years. Scribes were the intellectual class of their time. They could read, record, knew the law, economics, religion. I think this was one of the most prestigious professions in Egypt. Meanwhile, pharaohs and nobles lived quite differently. Their palaces were decorated with paintings, grand columns, bright fabrics. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a symbol of the state. If the pharaoh was strong, building, fighting, performing rituals, Egypt was in harmony. If the ruler was weak, problems arose. The throne was both an honor and a great risk. Everything the pharaoh did was viewed through the lens of cosmic order. Their styles varied. Some were warriors, others builders, others reformers. One of the most remarkable episodes in Egyptian history is associated with Akhenaten. He attempted to change the religion and establish the cult of a single god, Aten, the solar disk. This was a revolutionary idea in Egypt, where the pantheon of gods was deeply rooted in every aspect of life. Akhenaten even moved the capital to distance the country from the influence of the old priesthood. The reform was bold, but after his death, everything returned to its previous state. Egyptians were too deeply connected to their traditions to abandon them. After Akhenaten's era, Egypt gradually returned to its old ways. But this period showed how flexible the civilization could be, even with its conservative nature. People always returned to their familiar pantheon, to rituals passed down for generations. Such a bond with the past created stability. They believed that as long as they honored the gods, the country would prosper. And perhaps, friends, every nation has its symbols of stability. For the Egyptians, these were rituals, the Nile, and memory of their ancestors. Among the many kings and queens, Hatshepsut holds a special place. She was a woman who managed to become pharaoh at a time when this was nearly impossible. To secure power, she portrayed herself in the image of a man, with a beard, a crown, the garb of a pharaoh. But her reign was peaceful and prosperous. She built temples, developed trade, expanded Egypt's influence. There are even legends that she organized a great expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious place whose location remains unknown. This shows how open Egyptians could be to the outside world, despite their culture sometimes seeming closed. After Hatshepsut's death came Thutmose III, one of Egypt's greatest military leaders. He turned the country into a powerful state with territories beyond its borders. Egyptians understood that a nation's strength depended not only on harvests, but also on its ability to defend itself. Thutmose III not only fought wars, but brought new plants, animals, and crafts to Egypt. This enriched the culture, made it vibrant and diverse. And you've probably noticed in history that every great period of progress is almost always connected with openness to change and to foreign ideas. One of the world's most famous pharaohs is, without doubt, Tutankhamun. Although he ruled briefly and was very young, it was his mummy and tomb that caused a sensation. When archaeologists discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in the 20th century, it was almost untouched. Imagine what life in Egypt looked like thousands of years ago. People built enormous tombs, covered them with gold, filled them with everything needed for the afterlife. And then they hid them so well that some tombs simply disappeared from memory. Tutankhamun's tomb became a unique window into the past, preserved, almost frozen in time. Egypt's economy was just as complex as its political system. Its foundation was agriculture. The harvest depended on how well the Nile flooded. The water brought not only moisture, but fertile silt that covered the fields. Thanks to this, Egyptians grew barley, wheat, flax, and many other crops. Flax was extremely important because it was used to make cloth. Many people wore long, light tunics suitable for the hot climate. Producing cloth was difficult and time-consuming, so fine linen was valuable. Crafts also played a central role. Egyptians made furniture that resembled modern designs but was much more elegant. They made boxes, beds, chairs, tables carved with detail. Many of their items have survived, and when you look at them, you realize their craftsmanship and taste were at a very high level. Craftsmen created jewelry distinguished by colorful stones, gold, and glass. Egyptian jewelry still looks stunning today, especially when you remember it was all handmade with simple tools. Over time, Egypt developed a complex administrative system. Everything was written on papyrus, a unique material made from a plant that grew along the Nile. Thanks to papyrus, many documents, letters, and religious texts survived. Writing became the key to managing the state. Scribes were responsible for taxes, grain counting, censuses. Imagine their lives. A person sits in the shade, holding a reed and ink, writing down what officials say or what a superior dictates. This required patience and precision. And friends, when you read ancient papyri, you feel as if you can hear voices from the past. The texts seem so alive. One of Egypt's greatest mysteries remains the pyramids. They have stood for thousands of years, and although most theories of their construction are known, we still don't know everything. The enormous stone blocks weighed tons, yet Egyptians had no complex machinery. They used simple tools, ropes, wooden rollers, and ramps. Building required incredible organization, thousands of workers, and mathematical knowledge. The pyramids were not just tombs. They were symbols of eternity, order, the pharaoh's power. They showed that the ruler's life journey did not end with death. Egyptian pyramids are an example of how far human organization can go when an idea becomes more important than all obstacles. The workers were not slaves, as is often believed. Most were ordinary peasants working during the flood season when their fields were underwater. They received food, clothing, tools, sometimes housing. For them, building a pyramid was not just a job. It was participation in something that would outlive them. And perhaps this is why the pyramids still stand. They were not built by indifferent hands. The internal structure of the pyramids also impresses. Chambers, passages, ventilation shafts, complex corridors. All of this was designed to protect the pharaoh's body from robbers. Yet even the best engineering did not always withstand greed. Most tombs were looted long ago. Only a few remained untouched, giving us a glimpse into funerary culture. Egyptian temples were even more magnificent. They were centers of education, science, medicine, astronomy. Priests studied the stars, healed illnesses, preserved libraries. Their knowledge was organized, their authority immense. Imagine the Temple of Amun at Karnak. A whole complex with massive columns like stone forests, ceilings painted with bright images, huge statues of gods. People came there seeking answers, leaving offerings, asking for guidance. The temple was the cultural heart of the city. Egyptians were famous for their medical skills. They treated injuries, fractures, infections, made ointments, worked with herbs. Some medical papyri contain recipes for treating various conditions. Of course, some methods were magical, but many were practical and effective. They knew how to set bones, treat wounds, perform massages. Medicine combined science and ritual, and surprisingly, it worked, because no treatment was seen as separate from spirituality. Egyptian cities were lively and bustling. Markets sold vegetables, fruit, fish, crafts, fabrics, jewelry. Trade was crucial. Egypt exported grain, papyrus, linen, gold, stone. Imported wood, tin, copper, pigs, horses. Caravans crossed deserts. Ships traveled along the Nile and the sea. Egypt was part of a vast international network. Life flourished, and such a civilization could not exist without interaction with others. Daily life also had many interesting aspects. Food, for example. Bread and beer were staples, the main sources of calories. Beer was thick, nutritious, and safe to drink, brewed from barley. Richer people could afford meat, fruit, delicacies, but most ate fish, vegetables, grains. Meat was a luxury. Egyptians also loved sweets made from honey and dates. Clothing was simple yet elegant. Men wore short skirts, women long dresses, all made of linen. The finer the linen, the more expensive the clothing. Wealthy women used cosmetics. They painted their eyes green or black, used skin ointments. Egyptians cared about hygiene, bathed often, and groomed themselves. Their beauty culture was so advanced that some habits survive today. Egyptian society had a clear structure, yet within it, people could rise through education, service, or talent. A boy from a simple family could become a scribe if he showed skill. A brave soldier could receive land as a reward. A talented craftsman could become renowned. There were social pathways, though limited. Perhaps this flexibility helped sustain Egypt's stability across centuries. Family life was central. Egyptians valued family and saw marriage as essential. Husbands and wives worked together, raised children, managed households. Women had more rights than in many ancient societies. They could own property, divorce, work, run businesses. Some supervised workshops or trade. This suggests that in certain ways Egypt had more social equality than one might expect from an ancient society. Children were considered a blessing. They learned from an early age, but education was practical. Boys helped fathers in fields or workshops. Girls learned household skills. Still, many children could attend school if the family could afford it. They used wooden tablets to practice hieroglyphs and hieratic, a simplified script. Some became scribes, others craftsmen, but all gained the skills they needed. Egyptians believed in magic, not as superstition, but as part of reality. Magic did not contradict religion. It complemented it. Magical spells were used in healing, daily life, and rituals. There were special practitioners, magicians and priests, who knew formulas to protect people or bring good fortune. These texts were written on amulets, papyri, even pottery. Egyptians believed the word had power, that speech could shape events. They took this very seriously. Funerary culture was one of the most important aspects of life. When someone died, the family did everything to ensure the soul's peaceful journey. Even poor families tried to perform at least minimal rites, buying a cheap coffin or carving a simple one. Wealthy families paid for mummification, painted sarcophagi, statuettes, models of servants for the afterlife. These figures were called ushabti. They would supposedly perform labor on behalf of the soul. Imagine how complex a belief system must be when even after death, people think about avoiding unnecessary work. The underworld was imagined as a place of trials where the soul met the gods and faced judgment. The judgment of Osiris was the key moment. The heart was weighed. If it was pure, the soul proceeded. If not, the demon Ammit devoured it. This idea was so powerful that many texts placed in tombs contained formulas to help the soul pass judgment. The Book of the Dead, despite its title, was not gloomy. It was a guide, a navigation manual for the unknown. While belief shaped spiritual life, art preserved history. Egyptian artists did not simply paint, they conveyed information. Their frescoes, reliefs, statues were chronicles. They didn't depict people realistically. For them, the goal was not appearance, but meaning. Many figures are shown in the same poses and compositions. Yet if you look closely, each work has individual details. They depicted clothing, jewelry, daily life scenes with remarkable precision. Symbolism was central. Every color, gesture, and animal meant something. Blue symbolized the sky and water. Green represented life. Black, fertility and rebirth. White, purity. Animals were symbolic. Horus appeared as a falcon, embodying speed and strength. Bastet appeared as a cat, protection and home. Anubis, with a jackal's head, oversaw burial rites. All this created a visual language so complex that modern viewers can understand only part of it. Egypt's connection with nature was not limited to the Nile. The desert also played an important role. It was a barrier that protected the country from enemies. It was a place where oases emerged, small green patches among the sands. In these oases, people grew dates, grapes, and vegetables. The desert was not just a threat, but part of the landscape that shaped people's behavior. The sands preserved mummies, hid secrets, and helped builders, because the dry air protected materials from aging quickly. The Egyptian calendar was one of the most accurate in the ancient world. It was based on the movement of the sun and the star Sirius, whose appearance on the horizon was associated with the beginning of the Nile flood. The year consisted of 3 seasons: the flood, cultivation, and harvest. Each season was made up of 4 months. This allowed them to plan agriculture, rituals, and construction. The Egyptians had holidays dedicated to the gods, and these celebrations were an important part of life. People took part in processions, brought offerings, sang, and danced. The festivals combined religious and social functions, strengthening the community. The Egyptians built their way of life around the cycles of nature, and it is no surprise that their worldview was closely tied to repetition. Birth, death, the rising waters, the coming of the harvest, all this shaped the idea that the world did not move in a straight line, but returned to itself again and again. This thinking can be seen in their architecture, literature, and religious texts. Everything had a structure that resembled a circle. And perhaps, friends, this is why such a large part of Egyptian culture was aimed at eternity. They did not just want to live well. They wanted to remain part of the world even after death. Their literary heritage spans several millennia. Egyptians wrote tales, teachings, stories about gods, about the lives of pharaohs, about virtues. Some texts resemble modern parables. For example, there is the story of the eloquent peasant, where an ordinary man skillfully and eloquently defends his rights before officials, proving that even someone without power can prevail with truthful speech. Such texts show that Egyptians valued wisdom. Truth for them was not just a word, but the foundation of society. It is no wonder that the goddess of truth, Ma'at, was one of the most important. In royal palaces, life was very different from what one saw in the fields and markets, but the two worlds were closely connected. The pharaoh was a symbol of stability. He was depicted larger than other people in frescoes, not because he was physically a giant, but because his status was greater. His life was divided between rituals, state affairs, and military campaigns. He received foreign envoys, made treaties, and issued decrees. Nobles, priests, and officials surrounded him, for they were the ones who carried out his decisions. The pharaoh could not rule the entire country alone. There was a vast administrative system for that. High officials often belonged to families that passed down their positions from generation to generation. However, sometimes a talented scribe could rise high if he was noticed. Egyptian society, although appearing strictly hierarchical, still had room for capable people. And when someone from a family became a notable figure at court, it elevated the entire family in the eyes of society. Family ties were important, but not always decisive. Another important aspect of Egyptian life was diplomacy. Egypt was not an isolated state. It maintained relations with other countries and tribes. Many pharaohs married foreign princesses to strengthen alliances. Gifts came to Egypt from Nubia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. There were periods when Egypt had enormous influence over the Near East. Trade caravans brought goods, and along with them, new knowledge, technologies, and crafts. Diplomacy was no less important than military strength. Nubia's significance deserves special mention. To the south of Egypt lay a land rich in gold. Egyptians highly valued Nubian gold because it helped them build temples, decorate sarcophages, and create jewelry. Nubia also supplied exotic animals, and warriors who served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Relations between Egypt and Nubia were complex. Sometimes they formed alliances, sometimes they fought. But for centuries, Nubia was an integral part of the Egyptian world. In warfare, Egyptians showed not only strength, but also ingenuity. They used chariots, bows, spears, and shields. Chariots became important during the New Kingdom. The Egyptians learned to use them quickly and effectively, creating mobile units that could attack the enemy before he could react. Warriors were well trained, and each had his specialization. There were archers, spearmen, charioteers, infantry. One of the most famous battles is the Battle of Kadesh between Ramesses II and the Hittites. It had no clear winner, but it became an example of early diplomacy. Both sides concluded a treaty, considered one of the oldest peace agreements in the world. Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, was one of the most powerful pharaohs. He built grand structures, expanded borders, and strengthened the economy. His temples at Abu Simbel are examples of ambitious architecture. The statues of Ramesses are carved directly from the rock, and the inner temple is constructed so that twice a year the rays of the sun illuminate specific statues deep inside. This required extraordinary knowledge of astronomy and architecture. And when you stand before such monuments, you can feel how deeply the Egyptians understood nature and time. Nature played a central role in the Egyptian worldview. The Nile was not just a river, but the foundation of everything. Its water gave life, but it could also destroy the harvest if the flood was too strong or too weak. Egyptians carefully measured water levels using special devices called nilometers. These structures allowed them to predict the harvest and plan taxes. The Nile was so important that even the calendar was tied to its cycles. The flood began at roughly the same time every year, shaping the rhythm of life across the entire land. Aside from the river, Egyptians closely observed the sky. Their knowledge of astronomy was highly advanced. They determined important dates, oriented buildings by the cardinal directions, and tracked the movement of stars. Many temples were built so that on certain days of the year, light would fall on a precise point within the sanctuary. This demonstrates deep mathematical precision. Unlike many other peoples, the Egyptians managed to combine science and religion, creating structures that served both as temples and as observatories. The Egyptians celebrated a great number of religious festivals. Each city had its own main god, as well as many local ones. Some festivals were large-scale, others family-centered. For example, the birth of the god Horus was celebrated with processions, music, and offerings. People danced, sang, and brought food to the priests. Such festivals strengthened the bond between people and the gods, as well as among the inhabitants themselves. Egyptian culture valued community, and even religion served to unite society. Egyptian religious festivals were diverse, each with its own unique traditions. In different regions, they were celebrated differently. but the general meaning remained the same. These were moments when the boundary between the world of people and the world of gods seemed thinner. When countless people gathered together, the noise of the crowd, the smell of incense, the sound of drums and flutes created a feeling that the whole country was breathing in the same rhythm. And in the midst of this living wave, one could sense that the Egyptians did not just believe, they lived their belief. It was in every movement, every gesture, every street. Processions where statues of the gods were carried out of temples were especially grand. This was done rarely, so each such event attracted huge crowds. Priests carried sacred boats, special litters with the figure of the god, decorated with gold and precious wood. People believed that at these moments the god was walking among them. And although today it is difficult for us to imagine such a form of religiosity, we can still feel that for the Egyptians this was a moment that brought confidence that life was moving in the right direction. Temples were not only places of worship, but also centers of power and learning. They housed archives, trained scribes, healed the sick, and monitored the movement of heavenly bodies. The priestly schools were educational institutions where young people learned to read, write, count, and studied religion, medicine, and law. Scribes were one of the most important professions. Without them, the state simply could not function. They kept records of grain, taxes, and labor, and wrote down the pharaoh's decrees. A person who knew hieroglyphs automatically became part of the elite, not necessarily wealthy, but certainly respected. Hieroglyphs can be considered one of humanity's most fascinating inventions. The Egyptians created not just a writing system, they invented a way of thinking in images. Each symbol had its own energy, idea, and magical power. Writing was both an art and a form of magic. Priests and scribes believed that the written word could influence reality. That is why texts were placed on tomb walls, sarcophagi, amulets, and papyrus to protect, instruct, and guide the soul in the afterlife. Despite the sacredness of writing, Egyptians had different forms of script. Hieroglyphs were used on temple walls and monuments, while in everyday work they used a cursive style, hieratic. Over time, it evolved into demotic, an even simpler form. Scribes could record information quickly and conveniently. Papyrus, which they produced, became such an important invention that it was exported to other countries and effectively became the international writing standard of the ancient world. Egypt's economy was complex, and agriculture, trade, crafts, and construction played major roles. Agriculture relied on irrigation. Farmers worked on lands owned by the pharaoh, temples, or nobles. They kept part of the harvest and paid the rest as tax. Besides grain, they grew vegetables, fruits, and flax. Flax was extremely important because it was used to make cloth. Egyptian textiles were famous far beyond their borders. They were soft, thin, and light, perfectly suited to the hot climate. Craftsmen also played a key role in society. Stone cutters, carvers, potters, and jewelers created objects that we can see in museums today. Jewelry often had not only decorative meaning, but also protective power. They were amulets meant to guard against evil and bring good fortune. For example, the scarab symbolized rebirth, and the ankh represented life. Every object had meaning, and Egyptians treated such items with great respect. In a pharaoh's tomb, you can find thousands of objects, from gold ornaments to simple tools. They believed all these things would be needed in the afterlife. Building temples, pyramids, and monuments required huge numbers of workers. Many assumed that the pyramids were built by slaves, but in fact most of the labor was done by free people, seasonal workers, farmers, and craftsmen. During the period when fields could not be farmed due to the Nile flood, they worked on state construction projects and received food, clothing, and other necessities as payment. These workers lived in special settlements near the construction sites, with doctors, kitchens, and administration. It was organized labor, not forced labor. Daily life of Egyptians is particularly fascinating to study. What did they eat? What did their homes look like? What family traditions did they have? Bread was the main product. It was baked from wheat and barley. Bread was eaten with beer, a common drink consumed by everyone, even children, though it was weak and more like liquid porridge. Egyptians loved fruits and vegetables, dates, grapes, onions, garlic, cucumbers, melons. Meat was consumed less frequently, usually during festivals. Wealthier families could afford beef, duck, and goose. Poorer people often ate fish and legumes. Housing depended on social status. Poor families lived in small mud brick houses with a few rooms. These homes had little furniture, some mats, low stools, clay vessels. Wealthier families had large houses with several floors, an inner courtyard, and a garden. They decorated their homes with paintings, statues, and textiles. Large houses had guest rooms, kitchens, and storage spaces. Family was the foundation of society. Egyptians valued children highly and considered them a blessing. Everyone in the family had specific duties. The man was responsible for work outside the home. The woman for the home and raising children. But women had relatively high status. They could own property, go to court, and engage in business. Some even became priestesses, granting them special status. Clothing also reveals much about the culture. Egyptians wore lightweight linen garments. Men often wore short kilts. Women wore long, form-fitting dresses. Priests shaved their heads, while wealthy people wore wigs. Interestingly, fashion changed very little over millennia. They valued simplicity and purity. So many garments were modest in appearance. Egyptians paid great attention to hygiene. They washed daily, used scented oils, and wore jewelry. Even construction workers had access to water for washing. Cleanliness had sacred meaning. It was part of maintaining ma'at, the order Egyptians sought to uphold in everything. They were very serious about medicine. Medical texts contained dozens of recipes and procedures. Egyptian doctors treated wounds, fractures, eye diseases, and performed simple surgeries. They used herbs, honey, resin, and minerals. There is even evidence of dental treatment, though limited. Their knowledge was passed down through temples and medical schools. But religion remained the heart of Egyptian civilization. There were many gods, each responsible for a specific realm. Osiris for death and rebirth, Ra for the sun, Isis for motherhood and magic, Horus for royal power, Anubis for mummification, Thoth for wisdom and writing. Gods were depicted as humans with animal heads, or animals with human features. This was not fantasy. In the Egyptian worldview, animals symbolized certain qualities, and this form of depiction helped convey the essence of each deity. The afterlife, in their understanding, was not a dark place but a continuation of life. But to enter it, the soul had to pass the judgment of Osiris. The heart of the deceased was weighed on scales against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with sins, it was devoured by the monster Ammit. But if it was light, the soul entered the fields of Iaru, the ideal world of harvests, peace, and eternity. That is why Egyptians observed rituals so carefully and tried to live according to Ma'at. Their belief in the afterlife gave rise to the art of mummification. It was a complex procedure requiring knowledge, skill, and time. The body was cleansed, treated with oils, internal organs removed and dried. Then it was wrapped in linen bandages with amulets placed between the layers. The process lasted more than 2 months. The mummy was meant to preserve the body so the soul could return to it. Tombs were decorated with scenes from life, texts, and drawings. All this was meant to help a person after death. Objects believed to be needed in the afterlife were placed inside. Clothing, food, tools, furniture. In the tombs of nobles, archaeologists sometimes find cosmetics, children's toys, and musical instruments. This shows how deeply Egyptians wished to continue life into eternity. Although many people today view pyramids as symbols of death, they were actually symbols of life. They were monumental stairways to the heavens, leading the pharaoh to the gods. And when we look at them today, we can only imagine the grandeur of their original idea. Egyptian civilization, friends, did not arise suddenly. It developed gradually over thousands of years, going through periods of blossoming and decline. When we say ancient Egypt, we often imagine one unified world where all pharaohs, temples, and myths existed at the same time. But in reality, this civilization spanned almost 3,000 years, and the changes over that time were immense. It was not one state, but dozens of historical periods, each with its own heroes, achievements, and crises. Let us start from the very beginning, for that is where the character of the Egyptians is easiest to see. Long before the unification of the country, hundreds of years before the first pharaohs, small tribes lived along the banks of the Nile. They hunted, fished, gathered fruits, and later, when they learned to grow grains, they built the first permanent settlements. The river gave them everything: water, fish, fertile soil. And when people realized They could control the water level by building canals and dams. It was a real revolution. The land became richer, harvests larger, and life began to require more organization. With the development of agriculture came villages, then cities, and with them, leaders who managed people and allocated resources. Thus arose two main regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Each had its own symbol, lotus for Upper Egypt and papyrus for Lower Egypt. There were periods of conflict and peace between them. Eventually, when the ruler of Upper Egypt named Narmer, or Menes, defeated his rivals, Egypt became a unified state for the first time. This event was so important that Egyptian history essentially begins with it. Unification brought not just control over vast territories, but a new way of thinking. Egyptians began creating a system of governance, dividing responsibilities and building administrative centers. For the first time, there appeared a sense of the state, not as a temporary alliance of tribes, but as a structure meant to serve eternity. It was during this first period, which we now call the Early Kingdom, that the foundations of Egyptian culture began to take shape. Hieroglyphs acquired a structured form. The first mastaba tombs appeared, and stonework began to develop. People believed in the divine nature of the pharaoh. He was not just a ruler, he was a mediator between people and the gods. The idea that power came from the gods became the cornerstone of the Egyptian state, and remained so for thousands of years. And when the time of the Old Kingdom came, Egypt entered an era of unprecedented stability and prosperity. It was then that the Great Pyramids were built. But before these massive structures rose above the desert, the Egyptians spent a long time searching for the perfect shape for the eternal home of their rulers. At first, pharaohs were buried in mastabas, rectangular structures with flat roofs. Then the architect Imhotep proposed a new idea: to place several mastabas on top of one another, creating a step pyramid. This is how the famous Pyramid of Djoser in Saqqara was born, the first stone structure of such scale in human history. It was a revolution, and when the pharaohs saw how powerful such a structure appeared, they began striving for even greater grandeur. This led to the pyramids of Dashur, and later, the Great Pyramids of Giza. The Pyramid of Khufu, the largest of them, became a symbol not only of power, but of Egypt's extraordinary organizational ability. Imagine this, my friends: hundreds of thousands of blocks, each weighing several tons, all calculated with such precision that even today scholars are astonished. Yet these grand constructions were only possible because the country had a stable economy and a well-organized society. The pharaoh, officials, scribes, priests, artisans, farmers, everyone knew their role. Scribes worked in archives, overseeing taxes. Priests performed rituals and maintained the magical religious order. Farmers grew food. Artisans created tools and jewelry. Administrators controlled the distribution of grain and resources. Everyone functioned like part of a vast mechanism, one strong enough to withstand the test of time. But Egypt's history was not only a tale of greatness. There were also periods of decline, when the state lost its stability. The first intermediate period, which followed the Old Kingdom, was difficult. The central authority weakened, and local rulers, nomarchs, began fighting one another. Society lost its balance. Texts from that time reflect a sense of chaos. The rich have become poor, and the poor, rich. The Nile no longer floods as before. These phrases reflect not literal events, but the emotions of people who had lost their certainty about the future. Even during this troubled time, Egyptians sought ways to restore order. People longed for the return of Ma'at, cosmic harmony. And eventually, the country was reunited, marking the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a period many historians call the Golden Age. Although it did not produce monumental buildings like those of the Old Kingdom, art, literature, and diplomacy flourished. Pharaohs strengthened borders, built canals, and forged alliances. The development of literature in the Middle Kingdom is particularly interesting. Texts known today as wisdom literature emerged, teachings about how to live a proper life. Authors wrote about friendship, honesty, respect, and duty. For example, in the instruction of Ptahhotep, one can find advice that remains relevant even today. Egyptians strived to live according to the principles of Ma'at, harmony between people, nature, and the gods. Equally important was Egypt's territorial expansion. Middle Kingdom pharaohs developed strong relations with Nubia, building fortresses along the southern border. These fortresses, by the way, are impressive in their design, carefully planned with high walls, towers, and sophisticated water systems. They testify to the skill of Egyptian engineers. But time is relentless, and after the Middle Kingdom came another intermediate period, the era of the Hyksos invasion. These were peoples from the Near East who managed to capture part of the country. Their arrival brought new technologies, including war chariots, which the Egyptians later adopted and significantly improved. However, the Hyksos were never able to conquer all of Egypt. The southern region, ruled by native dynasties, resisted. Eventually, the pharaohs of Thebes, particularly Ahmose I, drove out the invaders and reunited the land. Thus began the New Kingdom, the most glorious period in Egyptian history. Egypt became an empire influencing the Near East, Nubia, and the Levant. The army grew more organized. Pharaohs launched military campaigns, and diplomatic relations flourished. This was the era of the most famous rulers: Hatshepsut, Thutmose, Akhenaten, and Ramses II. Hatshepsut, one of the best-known female pharaohs, strengthened Egypt's economic power. She organized an expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back incense, animals, and plants. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari is a masterpiece of architecture, combining grandeur and harmony. Thutmose III was an outstanding military leader. He is often called the Egyptian Napoleon because he conducted dozens of successful campaigns. Under his rule, Egypt became a superpower. Akhenaten carried out a religious revolution, attempting to introduce the worship of a single deity, Aten. This was so radical that after his death, the country reverted to its traditional gods, and many tried to erase his memory. Ramses II, the symbol of power and magnificence. He built temples, fortified borders, and fought the Hittites. His statues at Abu Simbel prove just how ambitious he was. The Egyptians did not merely witness history, they created it. But even after the greatness of the new kingdom, Egypt began to weaken. Neighboring states applied pressure, dynasties shifted. The power of the priesthood grew. Eventually, the country was conquered by the Assyrians and later by the Persians. Yet even then, Egyptians preserved their culture, language, and religion. They continued worshiping their gods, building temples, and conducting rituals. When Alexander the Great arrived, he was so impressed by Egyptian culture that he did not destroy it. Instead, he adopted the title of pharaoh. The city of Alexandria, which he founded, became one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the world. The famous library stored texts from across the known world. Even when Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, many traditions remained alive. Egyptian religion, art, medicine, and architecture influenced neighboring cultures. The goddess Isis, for example, was worshipped even in Rome. Egypt endured for millennia, leaving behind a legacy we continue to study today. Each chapter of its history is not just a set of facts, but an entire world one can imagine, feel, and live through in thought. If you want, I can continue. I have an enormous reserve of topics: mythology, daily life, specific dynasties, military campaigns, architecture, crafts, medicine, the history of individual cities. When we talk about Egypt, we often imagine pyramids, pharaohs, and sphinxes. But behind all this stood not just a state. It stood a philosophy of life so holistic that it permeated everything, from the way people cultivated the land to the way they understood death. Egyptians viewed the world as a system built on ma'at, balance, order, harmony, and this idea is present in every stage of their history. To understand why this civilization lasted so long, we must look not only at events, but also at the Egyptian way of thinking. They combined very rational ideas, like engineering knowledge, canal construction, calculations of harvests, with deep mysticism. They believed both were parts of one whole. The Nile was the foundation of this world. It did not merely provide water, it set the rhythm of life. Every year the Nile flooded, leaving behind fertile silt. This allowed them to grow wheat, barley, and flax. But to ensure stable harvests, they needed canals, dikes, irrigation structures. From early times, Egyptians understood that nature could be guided, and to guide it, people had to be united. It was through water management that strong centralized power emerged. The pharaoh was not only a symbol, but a guarantee that the river would bring its waters on time, that canals would be cleared, that grain would be collected and fairly distributed. Interestingly, even in religion, the Nile was seen not as a force of chaos but as a symbol of order. Hapi, the god of the river's flooding, had no temples, emphasizing that the flood was not something to fear or appease, but rather something to accept as part of the natural cycle embedded in creation. Egyptians perceived nature not as chaos, but as an intelligent design. They believed the world was created orderly, and a people's task was to maintain that order. Thus, it is no surprise that the pharaoh was regarded as the earthly embodiment of divine will. He did not merely have the right to govern, he had the duty to do so. His work was ritual, just like the daily temple services. Every official, priest, and scribe had a role defined not just by the state, but by the cosmic order. When we examine the functioning of the state, we can see how systematic it was. Scribes, that is a topic of its own. They were the people who created the state's memory. They recorded taxes, kept grain accounts, wrote laws, rituals, and royal decrees. Their education was so demanding that not everyone could endure the years of training. The children of scribes studied from an early age, sitting on the floor with wooden tablets, copying texts until their hands grew steady and their minds precise. In the cities, officials oversaw the work of artisans. Egypt was renowned for its craftsmen skilled in working with stone, wood, gold, and bronze. Artists created wall paintings with astonishing precision, and every detail in those paintings had meaning. It was not merely art, it was a way to preserve the essence of life. Egyptians believed that images had power. That is why tombs were decorated with scenes of hunting, farming, celebrations, everything a person wished to continue doing in the afterlife. And the afterlife, for them, was not an abstraction. It was a continuation of life, but a life ordered and harmonious. According to their beliefs, the soul traveled through the hall of Osiris, where the scales of Maat weighed a person's heart. The heart had to be light, free from wrongdoing. If it was heavy, it was devoured by the monstrous being Ammit, and the soul could no longer exist. But if the heart was pure, the person entered the fields of Yalu, a place of eternal abundance. To ensure this transition, the Egyptians developed complex mummification rituals. It was not merely a process of preserving the body, it was the art of restoring harmony. Embalmers knew which organs to remove, how to cleanse the body, how to wrap it in layers of linen soaked in resins. They placed amulets in the tomb, each with a magical function: to protect the heart, protect the voice, help the soul speak before the gods, give it the strength to walk, see, and breathe. But to understand the greatness of Egypt, one must also look at its military. The military system evolved gradually. While the Old Kingdom had little need for large armies, by the Middle Kingdom, the pharaohs actively fortified the borders. During the reign of Senusret III, a network of fortresses was built in Nubia to control the passages along the Nile. These were strategic locations with garrisons, storerooms, and security systems. In the New Kingdom, the army became even more organized. The Egyptians adopted chariots from the Hyksos and improved them, making them lighter and more maneuverable. They created specialized units of charioteers, archers, and infantry. The army of this period had a clear structure, insignia, and commanders of various ranks. Imagine the campaign of Thutmose III at Megiddo, one of the most famous battles of that era. The Egyptians passed through a narrow mountain pass where the enemy never expected them to dare enter. This strategic maneuver led them to victory. After the battle, the Egyptians not only won the field, but also gained control of trade routes that brought immense wealth to the treasury. Ramses II, in turn, became famous for the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. It was a massive military operation lasting several days. Although both sides claimed victory, the result was the world's first recorded peace treaty, the full text of which survives today. It illustrates how complex and diplomatically advanced that era was. But even the strongest armies could not hold back change forever. Egypt entered periods of struggle with the two peoples, internal conflicts, and the rising power of the temples, which at times overshadowed the authority of the pharaoh. It was a gradual weakening of the system. Yet the culture did not disappear. Even when Egypt fell under foreign rule, it preserved its identity. Under Persian rule, the Egyptians continued to write in hieroglyphs, build temples in the traditional style, and perform their rituals. Even the Greeks, who conquered Egypt after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, were so impressed by this culture that they tried to integrate into it. The Ptolemaic dynasty, of Greek origin, built temples in the Egyptian style and supported the cults of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. During this period, a great cultural center emerged, Alexandria. Scholars worked there, systematizing the knowledge of the entire world. Mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, historians, all of them wrote works that later influenced the development of science across the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria, though long gone, became a symbol of humanity's pursuit of knowledge. Egypt, at that time, was a meeting place of cultures. But this period, too, eventually came to an end. When Rome became a superpower, it incorporated Egypt into its domain. Yet even then, Egypt remained unique. Roman emperors adopted titles connected to Egyptian tradition. The goddess Isis was revered throughout the empire. Egyptian rituals were practiced in Rome, Athens, and Capua. And although in the 4th to 5th centuries AD, with the rise of Christianity, many temples were closed, and the cult of the ancient gods gradually disappeared, the memory of Egypt lived on. Hieroglyphs stopped being used around the 6th century, and the knowledge of them vanished for nearly 1,000 years. Only in the 19th century, when Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, did the world once again hear the voice of the ancient Egyptians. And this voice still speaks to us through the temples of Luxor, the pyramids of Giza, the statues of Memphis, and the paintings in the tombs of Thebes. These are not just ruins. They are traces of a great world that understood life as a path toward harmony. Perhaps That is why this civilization lasted so long. If you want, I can go even deeper. Mythology, the pantheon, occult beliefs, daily life, military campaigns, individual rulers, economics, medicine, science, architecture, even detailed descriptions of cities and temple complexes. When we dive into the life of ancient Egypt, it is very easy to see only the grand monuments, but the real life of the people is revealed when you start paying attention to the details. How they ate, how they communicated, how they worked, how they entertained themselves, what they believed about justice, duty, and family. I want you, friends, to imagine for a moment how a morning began in the cities along the Nile. The sun rose from beyond the eastern horizon, and this moment held special meaning, for the east symbolized the beginning of life, rebirth. People awoke with the first light, because days in Egypt were extremely hot, and it was better to work in the morning while it was still cool. Most people lived in one-story adobe houses. The walls, made of sun-dried brick, were thick to protect against the heat. Although the dwellings looked simple, there was a certain logic to them. Houses had inner courtyards where food was prepared. The roofs were flat, and in the evening, families would gather there to talk or sleep under the open sky during the hot season. Inside a house, one might find a clay bench, a table, a few woven baskets, and a jug of water. Not excess, but enough to live comfortably in their environment. Life was closely tied to work, but it cannot be said that it was nothing but exhaustion. The Egyptians knew how to turn work into a ritual. Craftsmen, farmers, fishermen, all of them put a piece of their soul into their tasks, believing that conscientious labor upheld the order of Ma'at. Perhaps that is why Egyptian objects, figurines, jewelry, pottery, still look so perfect even today. Farmers worked in close cooperation with the state. The pharaoh had enormous granaries where grain was stored. Officials recorded the harvest of each village. Taxes were collected not in coins but in goods: grain, oil, fish, flax. It may seem unusual, but such a system was stable and helped prevent famine if one region experienced a poor harvest. Craftsmen created wonders. In workshops, one could see carvers working with stone, making statues from diorite or granite. Nearby potters crafted vessels for the whole community. Jewelers produced gold ornaments with such precision that modern masters sometimes wonder how they could achieve it without complex tools. Large cities had professional districts. For example, in Thebes, there was a quarter of craftsmen who worked on royal tombs. Their settlement was called Deir el-Medina. It is one of the best-studied workers' settlements in all of ancient history. Archaeologists found letters, records, and personal items of its people. These findings allow us to see how ordinary Egyptians lived. The workers of this settlement were not slaves, as some might assume. They were paid, mostly not in silver, but in goods: bread, beer, fish, vegetables. Some received additional rewards: clothing, oil, honey. They knew their worth, for they worked on something meant to last for thousands of years, the tombs of the pharaohs. These people lived in a well-organized manner. The settlement had its own court, its own rules, even its own festivals. Workers often wrote notes to each other, complaining about neighbors or asking for help. All these small details show that Egypt had not just life, but a life with a rich inner world. When it comes to relationships between people, the family was the foundation of everything. The household included parents, children, and sometimes uncles, aunts, grandmothers, and grandfathers. Egyptians valued the stability of family ties. Even in art, men and women are depicted side by side, holding hands or placing their hands on each other's shoulders. This reflects the warmth of family relationships. Women had far more rights than in many other civilizations of that time. They could own property, make contracts, and divorce. Egyptian culture viewed man and woman as two parts of a whole that together created harmony. Religion also emphasized this balance. Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb, male and female principles always went hand in hand. Women also played an important role in temple life. There were priestesses of the goddess Hathor who took part in musical rituals, sang hymns, and played sistrums. Music was not merely an art, it was a form of magic, a way to connect with the gods. Egyptian medicine, too, was an extraordinary blend of practicality and magic. Physicians knew the structure of the body, could stitch wounds, set bones, and apply bandages. There are papyri containing recipes for medicines made from plants, honey, and salts. Their knowledge was remarkable for that time. Yet, alongside this, physicians might recite spells to drive away illness, believing that some ailments had a spiritual nature. Many people were healed through a combination of medicine and ritual. This did not seem strange. Egyptians saw no contradiction between the material and the spiritual. They perceived the world as a unified whole, in which everything was interconnected. As for science, the Egyptians achieved great success in mathematics and astronomy. They could calculate the area of fields, build pyramids with a precision difficult to match even today, and they created a calendar of 365 days, which they used for centuries. They observed the stars, determined festival dates, and oriented temples toward the rising of the star Sirius. But perhaps the most fascinating thing is their ability to build enormous structures without complex machinery. The pyramids are the pinnacle of this mastery. They were built over decades, but not by slaves, as is sometimes thought. Rather by skilled workers who were provided with food, clothing, and medical care. Their settlements have been found on the Giza Plateau, and they show that construction was carried out by a vast, organized workforce. Imagine this work. Tens of thousands of stone blocks, each weighing several tons, were hauled up ramps using wooden sledges, ropes, and the strength of countless workers. This was labor built on discipline, precision, and knowledge. The people who worked on the pyramids felt pride, knowing they were creating something that would outlive them. The temples were no less impressive. The temple at Karnak is a whole city. Halls, columns, lakes, obelisks. It was built over centuries. Each pharaoh added something of his own, as if wanting to leave a mark in eternity. And when you stand beneath the colossal columns of the hypostyle hall, you feel that these people truly knew how to build for eternity. Yet even in this majestic world, there were crises. At times, the state experienced decline. There were periods when central authority weakened. There were foreign rulers, famine, and wars. But each time Egypt managed to revive itself. And this is perhaps one of the strongest traits of this civilization, the ability to return to balance, to ma'at. At some point, we must also speak about the spiritual side of life, the mythology that formed the foundation of their worldview. But this topic is so vast that it deserves its own exploration. And if you wish, I can delve into each god separately. Ra, Osiris, Horus, Isis, Anubis, Ptah, Amun, each had their own stories, roles, temples, and cults. If we aim to truly understand ancient Egypt, we must immerse ourselves in its mythology, not superficially, not merely listing the names of gods, but feeling the logic of this immense spiritual world. The Egyptians created a pantheon where each god had a function, a character, symbols, a place in the cosmic order. And this order, as they understood it, was not a collection of invented tales. It was a model of the universe. Imagine a sunrise over the Nile thousands of years ago. For the Egyptians, this was not merely a natural occurrence. Every sunrise was the victory of the sun god Ra over the forces of darkness. Every day was a new act of creation. And when you ask yourself why this civilization was so focused on stability, on preserving order, on rituals, the answer lies here. The Egyptians believed that the world could easily slip back into chaos if people failed to uphold Ma'at. According to their beliefs, in the beginning, there was darkness, the primordial ocean, Nun. From this ocean emerged the first god, Atum or Ptah, depending on the regional tradition. But the most widespread version is that Atum gave birth to other deities. From him came Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture. These two brought forth Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. This was how the Egyptians explained the structure of the world. The sky arching over the earth, the air dividing them, and the ocean forming the foundation of everything. This system was not merely a myth. It was depicted on temple walls, sarcophagi, and in religious texts. It formed the basis of how the Egyptians saw their place in the world. If the sky and earth were gods, then every breath of wind was an act of divine presence. Every drop of dew, every flood of the Nile, part of a grand cosmic design. When you begin to examine the myth of Osiris, you realize that it is the heart of Egyptian culture. Osiris was the god of life, fertility, justice, and later became ruler of the realm of the dead. He was killed by his brother Seth, the god of chaos, desert, and storm. But Osiris's wife, Isis, found his body, gathered it piece by piece, for Seth had torn it apart, revived him through magic, and bore him a son, Horus. This son would later avenge his father and restore order. But Osiris did not return to the world of the living. He became Lord of the afterlife. In this myth lies the entire Egyptian view of life and death. Death was not an end. Justice was not an empty word. Order could be broken, but it must be restored. Even if the world fell into chaos, a force would arise to bring back balance. This is why the Egyptians so deeply revered Osiris. In many regions, sacred dramas known as the Mysteries of Osiris were performed annually, theatrical reenactments of his death and resurrection. People believed that by participating in these rituals they helped maintain the harmony of the world. Isis was one of the most revered goddesses. She symbolized motherhood, magic, loyalty, and care. She was a role model for women. And when you look at ancient depictions of Isis, you see not a goddess in the usual sense of other cultures, but a very human figure. A woman mourning her husband, protecting her son, safeguarding her family. Perhaps it is for this reason that the cult of Isis survived the fall of Egypt and spread throughout the Roman Empire. Her image proved so alive that it remained in human memory for millennia. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, was responsible for mummification and for guiding the soul into the afterlife. His images were often placed at tomb entrances, not to frighten, but to protect. The Egyptians did not see him as sinister. On the contrary, he was a helper. He prepared the body for the journey into the next world, and then guided the soul to the Hall of Ma'at, where its heart would be weighed on the scales of truth. This scene, familiar to many from ancient depictions, was crucial. A person's heart was placed on one side of the scale, and on the other, the feather of the goddess Ma'at, symbol of truth. If the heart was heavy, with sins, lies, treachery, it was devoured by Ammit. If light, the person could continue their existence. Do you feel, friends, how beautiful and profound this symbolism is? A person in Egypt believed that after death, they would be judged not for strength, wealth, or titles, but for the truth carried in their heart. As for temples, they were the centers of urban life. They were not merely religious buildings. Temples stored grain, provided education, healed the sick, and produced texts. Priests were not only ritual performers, but also scholars, administrators, physicians. In a sense, a temple was a school, a library, a hospital, and a state institution all in one. Temples had a complex structure. The outer courtyard was open to ordinary people, a place for markets, festivals, and processions. Beyond were inner halls accessible only to priests. At the very center was the sanctuary, a dark chamber containing the sacred bark or statue of the god. This was where daily rituals were performed. Interestingly, the public rarely saw their gods. Statues were hidden in sanctuaries. People saw them only during major festivals, when priests carried them in processions. But the most important thing is that the temple was a living organism. It followed daily rhythms. For example, at dawn, priests would awaken the statue of the god, opening the sanctuary, singing hymns, washing and clothing the statue, offering food. This was not a formality. It was a way to prevent the world from falling into chaos. For if rituals were not performed, the god could turn away from the world. And if he did, order would vanish. Continuing into temple culture, one cannot ignore Amun, the god who became a national symbol during the New Kingdom. His temple at Karnak is one of the largest religious complexes in the world. And the important thing is that this cult was both religious and political power. The temples of Amun owned vast lands, workshops, ships, herds. They had their own scribes, courts. Sometimes their influence could even overshadow the pharaoh's authority. This deserves separate discussion. For in certain periods, the Temple of Amun became the center of economic and political power. This is why the pharaoh Akhenaten attempted to reform religion, turning it toward the worship of a single god, Aten. But society rejected the reform. Egypt was too deeply bound to its traditional religion to change abruptly. After Akhenaten's death, everything returned to its former state. And when we observe this tension between change and tradition, it becomes clear that Egypt was not simply a land of pyramids. It was a complex living organism constantly balancing between old and new, between order and chaos, between the human and the divine. When we speak of ancient Egypt, we cannot overlook the cities, for it was in these cities, among narrow streets, white mud brick walls, the smell of bread from ovens, and cries from market squares, that the true life of this civilization unfolded. People often imagine Egypt as an endless sequence of temples and tombs. But Egypt was above all a home for millions of people who lived, worked, argued, laughed, celebrated, and raised children. And when you imagine their daily life, you begin to feel this culture much more deeply. Let us imagine a typical Egyptian house. It was built of mud brick, a mixture of clay, straw, and Nile silt. This material was perfect for the climate. It kept the interior cool even during the hottest days. Roofs were flat and often used as extra rooms. People dried fish, fruit, and grain on the roofs. They also spent evenings there, talking with family or watching the stars. Some families even slept on the roofs. It was cooler there. The entrance usually opened into a small courtyard. In this courtyard they kept pots, tools, sometimes animals, goats, chickens, cats. Beyond were living rooms, simple, with minimal furniture. Stools, low tables. Egyptians slept on wooden beds with rope bases, and instead of pillows, they used wooden headrests. It may seem uncomfortable, but they believed that such headrests kept the head properly positioned, allowed the body to rest, and even protected against bad dreams. And let us not forget that much of life happened outdoors. Egyptians worked near their homes, cooked in the courtyard or in small kitchens that were often separate rooms. The fire in such kitchens could heat the house too much, so they were built so that smoke could escape, or they were placed entirely separately. And here we must mention the smells of Egypt. the smell of fresh bread from clay ovens, the smell of fish drying in the sun, the scent of incense and resins used as perfumes, the smell of wet silt after the Nile flood. This was a world where scents had not only practical or emotional meaning, but also religious significance. Incense was burned in temples, used in healing and daily life. The power of fragrance was seen as divine power. Interestingly, Egyptian cities were relatively small. Paris or London, even in the Middle Ages, were larger. But Egyptian cities were always lively. Markets bustled from sunrise to sunset. Grain sellers, cobblers, potters, fishermen, craftsmen, scribes, all created movement, life, energy. And if you walk down an imaginary narrow Egyptian street, you can see children playing with knuckle bones, rolling hoops, or simply running between houses. Women sit by doorways, grinding grain, talking, exchanging news. Men often work outside the city, on temple construction, in the fields, in workshops. All this created a sense of rhythm, movement, and community. There were also wealthier quarters, such as the homes of scribes, officials, physicians, or highly skilled craftsmen. These houses were much larger, with many rooms and sometimes internal gardens. These gardens contained fruit trees, grapevines, date palms, various herbs. The walls inside might be decorated, painted with bright colors, ornaments, or scenes from myths. The wealthier the family, the more elaborate the decorations. Imagine how beautiful the house of an official during the New Kingdom must have been. Bright walls, narrow high windows, an inner courtyard shaded by a palm tree, the scent of roses or mint growing in a small garden. Such a house had rooms for receiving guests, a separate kitchen, storerooms of grain, and sometimes even small pools, not for bathing, but for cooling the air. Egyptian cities had a developed street system. In the Middle and New Kingdoms, cities were sometimes built according to a plan, with straight streets, identical blocks, even water drainage channels. This was especially true for workers' settlements. For example, Deir el-Medina, where the builders of royal tombs lived. There each house had roughly the same size and layout. Although small, they were very convenient. There was something like an organized community, shops, workshops, rules, and an active social life. And when you look at all this, you realize that Egyptian society was not simply complex. It was extremely organized. And the key figure in this organization was the scribe. A scribe was not just an official. He was the eyes and hands of the state. He kept records of grain, taxes, livestock, craftsmen, and workers. He wrote letters, drew up contracts, monitored the enforcement of laws. Scribes were educated people who knew language, literature, law, and religion. And it was no accident that in school students were encouraged with the saying, "A scribe lives twice, in life and in the memory of texts." Education in Egypt was a privilege. Ordinary people taught their children at home, but scribes went through special schooling. It was strict. Lots of practice, copying texts, studying hymns to the gods, legal documents, mathematical problems. Many lists of exercises have survived, repeated for centuries. The school of scribes was somewhat like modern academies, but with a strong emphasis on morality. Students were not only taught to write, they were taught how to behave, how to respect parents, how to serve the state, how to be honest. And interestingly, it is thanks to scribes that we know so much about Egypt. They preserved stories, chronicles, myths, economic documents, medical texts, magical spells, fairy tales, and even humorous stories. Reading these texts reveals that Egyptians were not dry bureaucrats, but people with humor, emotions, and worries. Sometimes a scribe complains in a letter about his fatigue, or his boss, or his students' poor handwriting. This brings ancient history to life and makes you feel that they were not so different from us. But everyday life in Egypt was not only work and structure, it was also festivals, rituals, music, and dance. Egyptians loved to celebrate. Few know that they had so many festivals that some cities celebrated nearly every month. Temples organized large processions, offered sacrifices, sang hymns, and danced. Sometimes the statue of a god was taken out on a boat along the Nile, while people shouted, sang, and threw flowers into the water. Egyptians believed that during such festivals, the god came out to the people, wanting to be among them. It was a kind of dialogue between deity and community. On such days, the city had a special atmosphere. Markets worked more intensely. Musicians played lutes and harps. Women adorned themselves with flower garlands. Children followed the procession. The whole city turned into one big celebration. Imagine the scents, sounds, and colors filling the streets. Everyone felt uplifted. And perhaps these festivals helped people endure hardship, fatigue, and difficulties. In all this, if you think deeply, Egypt was a very human civilization. It was not cold or overly austere. It was full of emotion, faith, joy, music, movement. When we speak of Egypt, we cannot ignore the Nile. Without it, there would have been no fields, no cities, no temples, no civilization itself. The Nile was not just a river. For Egyptians, it was the pulse of the land, its heart and soul. When it flooded, people rejoiced. When the water level was low, the entire society worried. And looking at how Egyptians treated the Nile, one sees that they felt almost parental respect for it. Every year, around July, the water began to rise. For us, it is just a natural event, but for them, the signal of new life. The flood brought fertile silt that settled along the banks. It transformed desert land into green fields where wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables grew. After the waters receded, people went to the fields and began sowing. All of this was done in harmony, almost ritually, for the timing determined the entire harvest. It is important to understand that the Egyptians were among the first to create an irrigation system. They dug canals, built sluices, and used special devices, shadups, to lift water to higher ground. This was a whole science passed down through generations. Every farmer knew how to work with water, distribute it, and take care of the canals. If canals clogged or collapsed, disaster could follow, so the state strictly monitored their condition. And since we have touched on agriculture, we must talk about field work. Egyptians plowed with wooden plows pulled by oxen. Grain was scattered by hand. Then goats or sheep were driven across the field to press the seeds into the soil with their hooves. It may seem simple, but it was a technique refined over centuries. For harvesting, they used sickles with flint blades, and they threshed grain by having cattle tread on it. Thousands of people worked like this season after season. After harvesting, the grain was stored in large state granaries. Why state? Because Egypt had a centralized economic system. The state collected taxes in the form of grain, oil, cloth, livestock. And this grain supported the army, officials, temple builders, and workers who built the tombs. The state was not just a government. It was the organizer of the entire life of the country. Without it, nothing would have functioned. And although this system may seem strict, it was very effective. And here we come to another important question. Who ruled all of this? Naturally, the pharaoh. But it is important to understand that in Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was a living bridge between people and the gods. He was not a king in the modern sense. He was considered the son of the god Ra, the embodiment of Horus on earth. He was the guarantor of order. If the pharaoh ruled justly, the Nile flooded properly, people had harvests, and the gods were satisfied. If the pharaoh acted wrongly, calamities followed. And although the image of the pharaoh always appears majestic, it is worth remembering that he carried incredible responsibility. He had to oversee the economy, religious rituals, wars, and foreign policy. He had a huge administrative system: viziers, scribes, officials, field inspectors, provincial governors. Without this system, the pharaoh would have been powerless. Now that we have mentioned the pharaohs, it is worth taking a moment to look at their personalities. They were not merely figures on walls or names in textbooks. Each had his own story. Ramses II, for example, knew how to create a myth of greatness around himself. He built grand temples, erected statues, carved his name on monuments. He was a ruler who wanted to enter history, and he did. He was called Ramses the Great. Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, built her greatness through peace, economy, and trade. She opened new trade routes, restored temples, and constructed magnificent buildings. And although some men later tried to erase her from history, she left behind an incredible architectural legacy. Akhenaten was a reformer, a dreamer who decided it was time to change the religion of the entire country. He centered worship around a single god, Aten. But his reform led to great contradictions. After his death, everything returned to the old ways. And this shows us how deeply Egypt was tied to tradition. Tutankhamun, though he lived only 18 years, became one of the most famous rulers today, solely because his tomb was found almost untouched. He himself was a young, weak ruler who hardly had time to accomplish anything. But his tomb gave us extraordinary knowledge about Egyptian life. But let us return to the everyday world. Because next to the kings lived hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. Egyptians believed in magic. It was not something unusual. It was a natural part of life. They believed that words had power, that writing could influence real events, that spells could protect, heal, and safeguard. And almost every family had amulets at home. An amulet in the shape of the Eye of Horus to protect against evil forces. A scarab amulet symbolizing rebirth. Small statues of gods. People wore them around their necks, placed them near their beds, or took them on journeys. Another important topic is medicine. Egypt was one of the most advanced medical centers of the ancient world. Doctors studied the body, performed surgeries, treated fractures, prepared ointments, infusions, and bandages. They could perform trepanation of the skull, set dislocated joints. Medical papyri preserved recipes for remedies made from honey, resins, herbs, milk, and minerals. Egyptians knew that wounds had to be cleaned and bandaged. They knew that honey had antiseptic properties. All this allowed them to treat many diseases, but medicine and magic were inseparably intertwined for them. A doctor could prescribe an ointment and, alongside it, a spell to drive away the spirit of illness. And for the Egyptians, this was completely logical, because the world was unified, both material and spiritual at the same time. All of this makes Egyptian civilization extraordinarily deep, and we are only touching its surface. If you tell me to continue, I will expand even further and in more detail. The army and weapons, naval expeditions, love and family life, the work of pyramid builders, art, clothing, jewelry, food, courts, crimes and punishments, diplomacy with other countries, great stories of rulers, religion in profound detail. I can unfold all of this in broad and rich chapters. When we move to the topic of love and family life in ancient Egypt, many are surprised by how gentle, warm, and attentive this society was to human relationships. There is a common idea that ancient people lived harsh, stern lives, but Egypt is precisely the culture where love was celebrated, written about, and considered a part of the world's harmony. The Egyptians had many songs and poems about love, and some of them sound strikingly modern. In these verses, a woman speaks about her beloved with such tenderness that it's hard to believe they were written thousands of years ago. Her voice is warm, alive, trusting. She says, "My beloved comes to me, and my heart rushes toward him." This is not official literature. These are genuine human feelings. Married life in Egypt was based on mutual respect. Yes, the man was often the head of the household, but the woman held enormous authority. She managed the household, controlled the budget, could own land, run her own workshops, and pass property to her heirs. In Egypt, women were more free than in many other ancient cultures. They could take legal action, they could divorce, they could sign contracts. And there are texts from that time describing cases where a woman complained about mistreatment by her husband, and the court sided with her. The very idea of marriage in Egypt was very simple. There were no grand ceremonies or rituals that today we associate with weddings. It was enough for a man and a woman to begin living together and agree on it. Yet marriage was deeply connected with family. Egyptians valued children immensely. They believed that children continued the family line, cared for their parents in old age, and honored them after death. Children grew up in an environment where learning was blended with play. Boys had wooden toys, small swords, little boats, figurines of animals. Girls had cloth dolls, small clay vessels, beads. Play was seen as a natural part of upbringing. Children also often helped their parents at work, in the fields, in the kitchen, in workshops. All of this created a strong bond between generations. If we imagine an Egyptian family in the evening, when the heat has subsided and dusk is slowly falling, we might see them sitting on the roof of their house, talking and telling stories. A small clay lamp gives off a soft light. The voices of fishermen can be heard in the distance. The smell of the evening river breeze floats in the air. In such moments, life seems very peaceful. The Egyptians knew how to appreciate such moments. Another important aspect of their life was food. Their diet was simple but nourishing. The foundation was wheat and barley. They used them to make bread and beer. Bread was everywhere, on the table, in rituals, as a form of taxation. Beer was the everyday drink, consumed by everyone, from children to the elderly, because it was nutritious and safer than river water. Vegetables, onions, garlic, lettuce, beans, cucumbers were grown along the banks of the Nile. Dates and grapes were used as desserts or dried for storage. Fish was one of the main sources of protein. Meat was eaten less frequently. It was considered almost a festive dish. In large households, the food was prepared by cooks. In small ones, by the family itself. Dishes were stewed in clay pots. Bread was baked in special ovens, and beer was brewed in large vats. The smells of the kitchen told as much about life as any archaeological discovery. And now, if we step a bit deeper into the world of crafts, we can see how skilled Egyptian artisans truly were. Every craft was an entire world. Potters created vessels of many shapes, from small cups to huge amphorae. Glassmakers produced beads, perfume flasks, and small figurines. Metalworkers crafted items from copper, bronze, and gold. Jewelers made decorations with extraordinary precision. Necklaces, earrings, bracelets, diadems. Every object was more than just an item. It carried symbolism. Gold jewelry was more than fashion. It symbolized protection, status, and the blessings of the gods. Amulets were worn not just for beauty, but for safety. A craftsman making an amulet was not simply carving a shape. He understood that he was creating protection for a person's soul and body. Every symbol had meaning. For example, the scarab represented rebirth, the Djed symbol, stability, the Ankh, life. All of this was part of the larger worldview. It is worth noting how the Egyptians understood beauty. They loved self-care. Both men and women used cosmetics. They painted their eyes with black coal, not only for beauty, but also as protection from the sun and infections. They used aromatic ointments. They used combs, mirrors, and perfumes. Imagine a woman sitting at a low table while a servant helps her apply fragrant oil, braid her hair, put on jewelry. This care was a part of daily life, a ritual of harmony. And since we touched on appearance, it is worth speaking about clothing. Egyptian clothing was simple but elegant. Linen fabrics, light and pale. Men wore kilts called calasiris, while women wore long dresses. Nobles had more elaborate outfits, pleated garments, accessories, belts. But even an ordinary worker wore clean, neat clothing. Egyptians loved to look well kept. Cleanliness was not only hygiene for them, it was a part of spirituality. And when you put all of this together in your imagination, the home, the food, the work, the festivals, the magic, the crafts, you see a vast, living world. A civilization that knew how to build pyramids and at the same time, how to sing songs about love. A world where magicians and doctors healed people beside writers who created stories that survived to modern times. A world where people worked hard, but knew how to celebrate. A world where every day began with faith in order, in ma'at, in the belief that the harmony of the world depended on them as well. When we speak about the army of ancient Egypt, we must remember that this state did not become powerful immediately. At first, Egyptians were more interested in agriculture, religion, temple construction, and the development of crafts. But over time, they realized that to protect their lands, wealth, and peace, they needed a strong army. And so began the long journey of building military strength. Early armies consisted mostly of militia, simple peasants who were summoned only in times of danger. They arrived with their own spears, wooden shields, and stone knives. Their weapons were simple, but sufficient against small enemies or bands of nomads. However, when Egypt encountered stronger neighbors, it became clear that a professional army was needed. It was during the New Kingdom that Egypt's military reached its peak. Chariots became the main striking force. The Egyptians did not simply use chariots. They made them light, fast, and maneuverable. 2 horses pulled a wooden platform on which 2 warriors stood. One drove the horses, the other shot arrows or threw spears. This was mobility that no one had seen before. Imagine the battlefield, dust rising like a pillar, the sun scorching, sounds cutting through the air, and then dozens of chariots appear, moving swift as the wind. They flank the enemy, shoot, and endlessly maneuver. It was a revolution on the battlefield. Archers also played a key role. The Egyptians were famous for the range and accuracy of their shots. The bow was composite, made of wood, horn, and sinew. Its draw strength allowed it to pierce leather or thin bronze armor. Arrows were made from reed, with bronze arrowheads. Each archer carried a quiver with dozens of arrows and could fire several shots per minute in battle. Infantry was the backbone of the army. It was divided into units armed with spears, axes, and daggers. Shields were made of wood covered with leather. Infantry soldiers were hardy, well-trained, and accustomed to long marches. They could travel dozens of kilometers under the blazing sun, carrying a shield, weapons, and provisions. The army maintained strict discipline. Commanders supervised order and training. Temple walls often depict training scenes where soldiers practice archery, fencing, and running. Interestingly, the Egyptians also employed mercenaries from other lands. The most famous among them were the Nubians, tall, strong, and skilled archers. They had distinctive hairstyles, used their traditional bows, and were among the best marksmen in the world. In the pharaoh's service, they received pay, land, or other rewards. There were also Libyans and Shurden, warlike peoples of the Mediterranean. The Shurden wore horned helmets and carried heavy swords and shields. Their units were considered elite. And against this backdrop unfolded one of the most famous battles of antiquity, the Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses II faced the Hittite king Hattusili III. Both states sought control over the territories of modern-day Syria. Imagine this monumental moment. Two powerful armies, thousands of soldiers, hundreds of chariots. At first, Ramesses fell into a trap, but miraculously managed to hold out, regroup, and strike back. The battle ended essentially in a draw, but its depiction in temples turned Ramesses into a hero. Importantly, it was followed by a peace treaty, one of the world's earliest known diplomatic agreements. Diplomacy was no less important than the sword. Egypt maintained relations with Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire. Letters written in cuneiform on clay tablets have survived to this day, the famous Amarna archive. In these letters, kings exchange gifts, propose alliances, complain about their neighbors, and negotiate marriage agreements. It is real diplomacy from 3,000 years ago, and reading them, one feels how global the world already was back then. But no army and no diplomacy would have been possible without the economy. The Egyptian economy was unique. It was based on the Nile, on agriculture, and on the proper distribution of resources. Land was the main wealth. The flooding of the Nile was watched very carefully, for it determined the future harvest. When the water receded, it left behind fertile black soil, called Kemet, the Black Land, from which Egypt's name derives. The pharaoh was officially the owner of all land, but he granted portions to temples, officials, soldiers, and craftsmen. People worked this land and paid taxes, which were collected by special government officials. Taxes could be in grain, oil, or textiles. The state then redistributed these resources where needed, to the army, the temples, builders, officials, and the workers in the tombs. A special place in the economy belonged to the workers who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Their village, Deir el Medina, was unique. These were highly skilled craftsmen, stone cutters, plasterers, painters, and carvers. They lived not as slaves, but as professionals. They had days off, holidays, and received rations of food and water. They often wrote complaints if their rations were delayed. They were a kind of creative class that produced the most important art of their era. Their work was complex and precise. To create a fresco, they first leveled the rock, then applied a layer of plaster, drew the main outlines, filled them with color, and only then added details. Imagine a person sitting in a narrow tomb corridor with a small lamp and a thin brush in hand, painting the eye of Horus, the face of a god, the wing of the goddess Isis. Every stroke was an attempt to convey something sacred. We often imagine Egyptian art as strict and motionless, but in reality, it is lively, flexible, warm. Frescoes show movement, emotion, and rhythm. There are scenes of festivals, dancing, and music. Women play sistrums, men lutes. Someone dances, someone plays the flute. This art portrays living people, not only gods and pharaohs. Music was everywhere. At festivals, in temples, at funerals, while working in the fields, while fishing. Egyptians loved rhythm and singing. Imagine fishermen pulling their nets to a chant, or workers building a temple and shouting rhythmic cries to stay in sync. Music and labor were often intertwined. Temples were centers of religion, but not only religion. They were also centers of economy, education, and medicine. A temple owned land, workers, and workshops. It could store grain, have its own fishing boats, even its own geese. The priests managed this economic system. They were highly educated people who knew mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and read sacred texts. And now we come to medicine. Egyptian doctors were among the best in the ancient world. Their knowledge survived in papyri. One of them, the Ebers Papyrus, contains dozens of recipes and procedures. There are descriptions of treating wounds, fractures, and infections. Doctors understood that the heart pumps blood and that vessels run throughout the body. They used herbal medicines, honey, resins, herbs, and oils. Honey was a natural antiseptic and was often applied to wounds. There were even surgical instruments, knives, hooks, forceps. Doctors combined medicine with magic. They treated not only the body but also the soul. For them, illness was a disturbance of harmony. A remedy could include both an herb and a prayer. In our modern world, this seems strange, but imagine when you live in a world where gods are everywhere, where each day is connected to the realm of spirits, A prayer is not just words, it is part of the healing. Egypt was a complex organism in which everything was interconnected. People, gods, land, water, sky, economy, music, war, art, love. And the deeper you dive, the more layers you discover. When we talk about the judicial system of ancient Egypt, we must remember that it was entirely based on the concept of Ma'at, truth, order, justice. Egyptians believed that the world was sustained by harmony. If someone violated this harmony through lies, theft, or violence, they were not simply harming another person. They were bringing chaos into the very fabric of the universe. That is why courts in Egypt had an almost sacred status. Judges were people who were trusted, usually high officials or priests considered experts in law and morality. Court sessions were held publicly. Anyone with an interest or simply curious listeners could attend. And this is a very interesting detail because public hearings created an atmosphere of honesty. The judge could not act secretly, and people could witness the entire process. Crimes of all kinds were heard, from grain theft to disputes between neighbors, from domestic conflicts to violations of state orders. Many cases tell of women filing complaints against men, workers against officials, peasants against landowners, and importantly, the court often sided with the common person if their words were supported by evidence. The Egyptians did not have a written code like the laws of Hammurabi. Instead, they relied on precedents, instructions, teachings of wise men, and most importantly, the principle of Ma'at. It was a kind of moral compass. A judge had to feel what was true. And although this may seem vague, such a system, based on tradition and morality, functioned for a very long time. Punishments varied. For minor offenses, a fine. For more serious ones, corporal punishment or exile. For crimes against the state, execution. But executions were rare, as Egyptians greatly valued life as a gift of the gods. Often a person could be required to compensate for damages, work for the state, or swear never to repeat the offense. A particularly important place in society belonged to scribes. Without them, Egypt could not have functioned. These were the people who could read and write, skills possessed by only a small percentage of the population. A scribe was an administrator, judge, accountant, historian, archivist, all at once. They kept grain records, wrote court documents, drafted contracts, composed letters on behalf of pharaohs, and created instructions and religious texts. Scribes studied for years. They sat in schools, usually rooms attached to temples or administrative centers, and spent hours copying texts. Their tools were a column, a reed pen, and ink made from soot or ochre. Special training collections were created for them, moral instructions, parables, short stories. Imagine a young scribe sitting on the floor, carefully drawing hieroglyphs, repeating the lines again and again until the movement of his hand became perfect. Scribes held enormous authority. They were depicted slender, with a pen in hand, a symbol of wisdom. One well-known text even said, "Happy is the scribe, for he does not plow the earth, does not carry stones, does not labor in the fields. His tool is the word." And indeed, a scribe did not merely write. He created reality. Laws, orders, and contracts existed only when they were written down. If we move to religion on the deepest level, we must mention the mystical texts. The Book of the Dead, the Book of Amduat, the Book of Gates. These are entire cosmologies describing the journey of the soul after death. The Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a complex path through the realm of darkness. The soul had to pass through gates, meet gods, answer their questions, and demonstrate the purity of its heart. The most famous ritual is the weighing of the heart. After death, the soul was brought before the hall of the goddess Maat. There stood the scales. On one side, the person's heart, on the other, the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth. If the heart was lighter, the soul passed into eternal life, into the fields of Yaru, where peaceful existence awaited. Green meadows, calm waters, serenity. But if the heart was heavy, it was devoured by Amat, a creature with the head of a crocodile, a lion, and a hippopotamus. This was the end of the soul, a second, final death. The ritual of mummification was a way to preserve the body for this journey, and the process was extremely complex. First, the body was purified, then the internal organs were removed, except for the heart. The brain was extracted through the nose with special hooks. The organs were placed in canopic jars protected by the sons of Horus. The body was dehydrated with natron, filled with fragrances, and wrapped in dozens of layers of linen bandages. Amulets were placed between the layers. It was not enough to preserve the body. It was necessary to create a protective shell for the soul. Tombs were entire miniature worlds. There were figurines of servants who were meant to work in the afterlife instead of the deceased. There were chests with food, clothing, and tools. There were texts instructing the soul on how to pass through the gates of night. There were frescoes showing the journey from sunset to sunrise. For in Egypt, everything was connected with cycles, repetition, and rebirth. And here we approach what makes Egypt truly special: its ability to create eternity. People who lived 3,000 years ago believed they could leave a part of themselves in stone, in words, in paintings, and they did. When we read their texts today, look at their statues, or feel the cold of pyramid corridors, we are touching the same thoughts, the same fears, the same dreams. They wanted to be remembered, and we remember them. This was a world where people awoke to the view of the Nile, worked hard, but believed in harmony. A world where a child could become a scribe, an official, a pharaoh's advisor. A world where music echoed even in dark temples, and the scent of incense lingered in the air. A world where death was not an end but a transition. And the deeper we look into it, the more we understand. This civilization created something that still lives today. Well, my friends, we have traveled a long road together. From the shores of the Nile to the deep halls of temples, from bustling markets to the silence of tombs, from the battles of Ramesses to the gentle poetry of love. Ancient Egypt is not just old stones. It is a world that lives as long as we speak about it. A world in which people searched for meaning, harmony, and justice. And you'll agree, there is something very familiar to us even now. If you found this interesting, if you want to continue traveling into the past with me, then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write in the comments which civilization you want to hear about next time. Because history is not just the past. It is a conversation between us and those who lived long before us. Thank you for being here. Until next time.